Thanks also to the planning committee that organized this series on making democracy work under Patty Garrett's leadership, and to the Brennan Center for Justice for sending us such a distinguished speaker tonight. I'm Patricia Nugent, past president of the Saratoga County League of Women Voters. The League is a nonpartisan, yet political organization that encourages informed and active participation of citizens in government. It seeks to increase understanding of public policy and to influence it through education and advocacy. In other words, the League is committed to helping our still young nation fulfill its promise of being an inclusive democracy influenced by an informed electorate. The League takes positions on issues such as climate justice, access to health care, immigration reform, reproductive choice, workplace equality, and choosing diplomacy over war. But we do not endorse candidates or political parties. I want to welcome our elected officials here tonight. We have two. Peter Martin is here. He is the Commissioner of Public Safety for the City of Saratoga Springs. And also Tara Gaston is here. She's a county supervisor representing the City of Saratoga Springs. Are there other elected officials I have missed or representing elected officials? We do know that they were all invited. I also want to welcome any candidates. Are there any candidates for office who are here? Okay. When you meet candidates, make sure you ask them why they weren't here. I also want to welcome our students. So there's some high school students here, as well as some Skidmore students. I hope that we can all be as courageous as those high school students in Florida have been. The League was formed when female U.S. citizens gained the right to vote. 150 years after our democracy was founded. At the Seneca Falls Suffragist Convention in 1848, the right to vote was only one of the many votes that women demanded. And it was considered their most outrageous and controversial demand, because there is recognized power in the vote. In the name of the suffragists, the League today is committed to protecting voting rights for all Americans. In the words of President Johnson, when he signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act into law, the right to vote is the basic right, without which all others are meaningless. In 1966, when the Supreme Court declared the poll tax illegal, President Johnson said, "Nothing is so valuable as liberty, and nothing is so necessary to liberty as the freedom to vote without bans or barriers." So I'm going to take a page from our president and go off script for a second. Because, and that works so well for him, I know. I'd do better with that. But I have to ask, why isn't the auditorium full and why aren't we standing in the hallways? This is a great turnout, but why aren't we full?
Yes.
And I talked to Chris about it, about turnout today, and he said it's a subject of much discussion at the Brennan Center. And their conclusion is that people don't care until they care. And maybe that's until their grandmother starts crying at Sunday dinner because she no longer drives and doesn't have a photo ID, so she can't vote. Maybe that's when it hits home for people who aren't here. As many of you know, I'm a Susan B. Anthony groupie. She died before women's suffrage was achieved. And on her deathbed, 2 hours before she became unconscious, She said, "To think I have had more than 60 years of hard struggle for a little liberty, and then to die without it seems so cruel." We are still struggling to protect voting rights more than 110 years after Susan B. Anthony died. And it still seems cruel to be making it hard for American citizens to vote. Just today, the Saratoga County Board of Supervisors handily passed a resolution against early voting and against automatic voter registration. One partisan election inspector declared it was too expensive. After all, they'd have to print more ballots. But upon questioning, he had to admit there had not been a cost analysis done. And that decision was based on a conversation he had had with a colleague in 2013. Today, in 2018. And to quote one person who spoke in opposition, that's just wrong. Voting is the foundation of our democracy. Like the League, NYU's Brennan Center for Justice is at the center of the fight to preserve and expand the right to vote for every eligible citizen. Through practical policy proposals, litigation, and advocacy, the Brennan Center works to ensure that voting is free, fair, and accessible for all Americans. And they've sent us an expert tonight to increase our knowledge and our advocacy. Chris Deluzio serves as counsel for the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where he focuses on voting rights and elections. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Mr. Deluzio was a litigation associate in private practice and maintained a pro bono practice of representing indigent defendants in criminal matters in federal court. He received his J.D. magna cum laude from Georgetown Law in 2013. It's the same year that they did the research on. There he served as an executive articles editor of the Georgetown Law Journal and was selected as the top oralist in the Thurgood A. Marshall Memorial Moot Court competition. He received his undergraduate degree from the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. Following graduation from Annapolis, he served as an active duty naval officer. Mr. Deluzio's military service includes multiple deployments, including a tour of duty with Army Civil Affairs in Iraq. He's now serving his country in another capacity by protecting voting rights. So welcome, Chris. Thanks so much.
Tough act to follow. Thanks to all of you. As Pat said, my name is Chris Deluzio. I'm from the Brennan Center for Justice, and let me just start off by saying the League is a very important and frankly, one of our best clients and partners, and so we're really excited to support you tonight, and for me to do this, it's a great honor. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to turn the lights down just a bit. I think some of this text may be a little hard to read, so give me just 1 second. All right. So who are we at the Brennan Center? As many of you know, we're a nonpartisan law and policy institute that seeks to protect our systems of democracy and justice. We're named after Justice William Brennan, who's pictured there. He served on the court during, frankly, one of the most important eras of the court's history, the Civil Rights era. He believed strongly in the idea of a living constitution. That's the idea that our democracy and our rule of law should evolve to deal with problems of today. He cared a lot about democratic systems like the League, like the Brennan Center. On our voting rights and elections project on which I work, our we try to be at the center of the fight to preserve and expand the right to vote, to register, and to do it without excessive burden. And here's how. So we're a think tank. We're an advocacy group that pushes for new legislation and ideas. We're a public interest law firm that litigates cases across the country. And we're a communications group that changes the way people think about issues, whether it's through press appearances, op-eds, speaking to groups that are engaging with voters in the community, a whole variety of ways. So the plan tonight, I'll talk a little bit about the history of voting rights, and trust me, it won't be a graduate level lecture. We'll do a quick survey, so we're not here all night. I'll talk a little bit about some major issues that we're seeing currently, some challenges and some things that give us hope, and then talk a bit about the efforts to secure our elections from foreign interference, which is quite timely these days. So the history of voting rights, we got it up there. There we go. In this country is one of a steady and prolonged fight to secure the franchise. Our starting point, frankly, was principally white property-owning men. So we've come a long way, but there's a lot still to do. Like much of our history, if you think about the history of expanding the right to vote, there are many moments where we had progress forward, but also steps backward. And that's not just voting rights, that's plenty of areas of our country. So what I'll do now is it's again, far from an exhaustive survey, but I want to touch on some of the key high and low points of the fight to expand the franchise. So we've amended our Constitution several times to expand the franchise. Based on race, based on sex, and age for those, poll tax, barring someone who can't pay a poll tax for voting, and on account of age for those 18 and older. The league itself, as Pat noted in her introductory comments, can trace its origins to the early days of women's suffrage, and in particular efforts to register newly enfranchised women and get them on the rolls. It took a long and bloody civil war, frankly, for the first two up there, 14th and 15th Amendments, to become reality. And as I'm sure most of you know, that was far from enough to secure the franchise in much of the South through the Jim Crow era, unfortunately. And that struggle, frankly, continues today. And drawing that historical line from post-Civil War through the civil rights and Jim Crow into the civil rights era today is pretty clear. So I'll touch on that part of our history because, frankly, it's, I think, representative, indicative of what we face and where the challenges draw their historical origins. So if we focus there, many of the harshest laws targeting African Americans have roots just after the Civil War, and in particular when legislatures passed so-called black codes. And those laws sought to enforce harsher penalties against crimes thought to be more likely committed by blacks in the South. African Americans were aggressively arrested and imprisoned under these laws. And once in prison, the state would then lease out convicts, citizens, mind you, to work on private plantations and factories throughout the state, effectively using the court system and the criminal justice system to reinstitute a form of slavery in the South. This effort, frankly, was part of a broader one to circumvent the Civil War amendments like the 14th and the 15th Amendment that we saw earlier. Disenfranchisement laws, which are laws, I'll talk about it in a bit, but frankly, or simply, are laws that take away the right to vote for citizens who are convicted of certain crimes, which were used extensively in the South after the Civil War through the Jim Crow era. But those laws worked hand in glove with aggressive, targeted criminal enforcement and prosecutions, as well as the profit motives behind convict leasing. Together, they helped to ensure white political dominance for nearly a century in the South. It doesn't take much of an intellectual leap to draw that line, again, from this post-Civil War era through the Jim Crow era, through today, where similar efforts try to suppress the vote, try to disenfranchise people. So it took until 1965 for Congress, at the urging of civil rights leaders, President Johnson, groups like the League and others, to finally pass what became a landmark civil rights piece of legislation, the Voting Rights Act. It it cut right at the heart of the Jim Crow South, and laws affecting the franchise, whether it's getting on the rolls or exercising the franchise at the polls itself. It's widely regarded as one of the most important, if not the most important, civil rights legislation in our history. And in some, without getting too much into the statute itself, it allowed citizens and the government to challenge discriminatory laws in court. And critically, through something known as preclearance, citizens and the federal government, well, first the federal government, it required states with a history of discrimination based on formulas in the statute to seek preclearance from the federal government before they could implement laws affecting the franchise, affecting the vote. Citizens could also challenge things in court, but the idea was that you had to get permission from the Justice Department who would sign off on whether things were discriminatory or not. That's key, and you'll see I have some things highlighted in red, and as we'll learn in a bit, the Supreme Court eventually strikes this down. In the meantime, though, I do want to talk about in the years between this and the Shelby County, which is the court decision dealing with the Voting Rights Act. There were some other key federal statutes that I'm sure the League is familiar with given its work. One, what we call Motor Voter, the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, Congress passed to provide a uniform and simplified voter registration form, the federal form. Many of you have probably seen it in drives and efforts to register folks. Required the states to make the form available at various agencies, like the DMV is the principal one, and to accept and use the forms for registration. Also allowed community groups to use the form to register people. Other key law, this was passed in the aftermath of the 2000 election, is the Help America Vote Act, which, among other things, mandated significant changes to nearly every aspect of election administration, but one of the most principal of those was that the states were now required to maintain a computerized statewide database of voters rather than county by county, and that made a big difference in terms of election administration. Also gave states funds for several things, including voting machines. So back to Shelby County, which is unfortunately this Supreme Court decision from 2013. This steady march of progress, which in some ways it's appealing, right? We passed the Voting Rights Act, we had Congress passing other laws, the franchise is steadily expanding. 2013. The Supreme Court strikes down a key portion of the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County decision. That decision, in essence, found that the coverage formula, and that's the piece of the Voting Rights Act that identifies which jurisdictions must seek preclearance. Preclearance, again, being the requirement that you get the Justice Department to sign off on changes to voting laws. The Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional, effectively stripping the Voting Rights Act of much of its teeth. Without that coverage formula, what happens instead is citizens are forced to challenge new changes or laws in court after the fact. That can take time, it can be expensive, and just as a point of comparison, in the 15 years before the Shelby County decision, the preclearance process blocked 86 proposed election changes administratively and many more through litigation. In the single year after Shelby County, 53% of the states previously covered passed restrictive voting laws compared to just 9% of other states. 53 versus 9. Citizens now, as I said, they have to challenge things after the fact, wade through the courts, take the litigation expense, hope they have lawyers who will do it for that period of time. It's a very different process. You can imagine it's been a major and substantial setback to voting rights and the fight to protect voting rights. And I think it's indicative of what I started this conversation with, the broader push and pull of progress. And yes, we're making progress forward, but there are also things like this that are substantial setbacks. And I think that's how much of the history of the fight to vote, as we like to call it, has been. So, I said I would next turn to major current issues in voting, and we'll do that, but just to give you all a sense of where we're headed, I'll talk not only about some challenges we're seeing and problems, but also some solutions and things that we're doing at the Brennan Center, oftentimes with the help and support of the League, to try and counter some of the more negative things and expand the franchise. And I guess one of the more negative side of things is the actions by states in the aftermath of Shelby County, right? I mentioned that the number of states who were previously covered had taken action. Unfortunately, those aren't outliers, and I'll highlight some of the things that are happening in states to that effect. So this is a good start, unfortunately, of where the problems are. At least 6 states, you can see them there in dark red, enacted new restrictions in 2017 alone. And a pretty, frankly, geographically diverse set of states. Critically, New Hampshire is really at the forefront of trying to make it harder for students to vote. 14 states, and those are the light red or pink states, had new voting restrictions in place for the first time in a presidential election in 2016. So it's not to say there aren't other states that have restrictions or that pass new ones. These are just states that had new ones in place for the very first time. That gives you a sense of what's going on out there in terms of trying to keep people from the polls. The most common, just to give you a flavor of it, are voter ID requirements or voter ID laws. So this year, we've seen, we do at the Brennan Center what's called a legislative roundup, where we keep track and follow the bills and legislatures throughout the country. So as of February 13th, we completed our most recent round, so just in the last 2 weeks. 44 states in the District of Columbia had their sessions active, with a special session in North Carolina. 28 bills to restrict registration and voting introduced in 14 states. That's pretty substantial. Thankfully, New York is on that list. But you see it cuts across red or blue and purple. It's geographically diverse. It's everywhere. So it's a real challenge. So we think that these new voter suppression laws, as I call them, as we call them, only exacerbate an older and more mundane problem, and that's the fact that our voter registration system is flawed, has some problems, and might be broken, frankly. As you know from your work in the league, it takes quite a lot of resources and effort to register people to vote, eligible people to vote. There are real problems with creating and maintaining accurate registration records. Counties and towns, depending on the state, have to spend a different amount of resources and coordinate with state officials. It can be taxing. According to a 2012 study, just as an example, 24 million registrations nationwide contain serious errors, That's roughly 1 in 8 registrations across the country. We also think that the registration system is costly and inefficient. Part of that stems from the different offices and levels of offices and coordination that must occur. Bottom line is that we have up to 51 million eligible voters. These are citizens who are eligible to vote, who remain unregistered. That's not voting, that's not even registered on the poll books to be able to vote. That means roughly 1 of every 4 eligible voters is not registered, a quarter of our country. It's frankly a travesty, and we think dangerous to the healthy functioning of democracy when you have a quarter of eligible people not even on the books, let alone showing up. But unfortunately, that 51 million figure doesn't capture the full extent of the problem. It's actually a little bit worse. There are over 6.1 million American citizens who are unable to vote because of a criminal conviction, been disenfranchised. The impact of felony disenfranchisement laws, again, those are laws that, because of a criminal conviction, take away or strip someone's right to vote, falls disproportionately on minority groups. Across the country, 1 in 13 voting age African Americans lost their right to vote. That's 4 times the rate of all other Americans. So of those who are disenfranchised, again, citizens, out of prison, living and working in their communities, out of the 6.1 million, I should say 4.7 million are out of prison, living and working in communities. That's roughly the population of those states, which is bigger than the city of Los Angeles, for reference. So this map, frankly, is confusing, right? This is supposed to show you the different approaches of states with how they deal with criminal convictions and the right to vote. On the one end of the spectrum, you have states like Vermont and Maine, where they don't disenfranchise people. On the other end, you have places like Florida, Kentucky, Iowa, where you lose your voting rights for life. Doesn't matter what you did, when you did it, unless the governor restores your rights to vote, they're gone. You've lost them forever. Most states are this dark blue. That means you can't vote until you've completed all of the terms of your sentence. That tends to include things like probation or parole. You also have to generally pay fines and fees, which if someone has been in prison and not of substantial means, that can be quite a challenge. New York, in particular, is strange. So you can vote if you're on probation but not on parole. Right? That seems weird. It causes confusion, so we at the Brennan Center said, okay, let's do a study. We asked election administrators, just tell us what the law is. And we found that roughly a third didn't get it right. So if a third of election administrators don't know when someone who's out of prison is allowed to vote, you can imagine what someone leaving prison might think about, I don't know what the law is or what the rules are. It's confusing. Our view, just so folks here know, the Brennan Center's view is that people who are living in the community, left prison, jail, served their sentence, ought to be able to vote. So here's some tweets, lovely. So all of this, and I say this to mean the disenfranchisement laws we talked about, our turnout problems, it's happening against a backdrop of misinformation at the highest level of our government. The president has made baseless allegations about widespread voter fraud, famously made those allegations just before then-candidate Trump tweeted, quote, "Of course there is widespread voter fraud happening on and before Election Day," end quote. And even more famously, I think, after the election he claimed, quote, "In addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally," end quote. He repeated that claim of 3 to 5 million people illegally casting ballots in 2016. We've heard it several times. To be blunt, that's ridiculous. But, we went and checked anyway. And it's ridiculous. So we interviewed local election officials representing 42 jurisdictions in 12 states that test claims of illegal voting in the 2016 election. They found no substantiation for claims of significant fraud. In fact, and this is kind of wild, these election officials oversaw the tabulation of more than 23 million votes, referred 30 incidents of suspected non-citizen voting for further investigation and prosecution. So the math on that is that improper non-citizen votes accounted for 0.0001% of the 2016 votes in those jurisdictions. Hardly the missing millions, right? Despite that, those crazy claims resulted in the Fraud Commission, or the Pence-Kobach Commission on Election Integrity. Thankfully, the White House disbanded the commission in 2018, in January of this year, thanks in no small part to the League's work. A driving force that many of you may be familiar with behind the commission, and the commission's vice chair, is Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach. He actually called the League communists for challenging one of his initiatives. So at a press conference in Kansas, he said, quote, "You can quote me on that, the Communist League of Women Voters." The Kansas League is actually one of our clients. But in terms of the work we did with the League, we at the Brennan Center, League partners in Indiana, in Texas, and Utah, we took aim at the commission with a creative approach. Our theory was to hold state election officials accountable. We sued them under state law and state court, saying you can't turn over this information without violating the privacy of your citizens. And we think that that had a big impact on the eventual dissolution of the commission. So we think restrictive voting laws and other efforts to suppress or intimidate voters, and frankly keep them away from registering, have potentially contributed to our lackluster turnout stats. And you can see some of the numbers up there. It's not pretty. Frankly, it's a question we ask ourselves, and I imagine many people in this room do as well, is why so many of our fellow citizens feel disengaged or think it's not worth the effort to register or to vote. It's a tough question. I don't have a great answer for it, but it's what we think about constantly, about how to get people re-engaged or re-energized to do it. Speaking of bad turnout, New York is pretty bad. We were, in 2016, in the bottom third of turnout nationally. It's a real problem. We also think that online voter registration in New York, which is available only on the DMV website, is problematic because it doesn't capture people who don't drive or don't have a reason to interact with the DMV. There's also some good news, fortunately. Governor Cuomo recently announced he would amend his budget bill to include funding for early voting. That proposal includes $7 million to enable early voting for 12 days, prior to Election Day, including on weekends, with at least one site for every 50,000 residents in each county. I think, as many of you probably know, Assembly and the Senate still need to approve that and vote on that. So we urge all of you to contact them and ask them to do it. I know that that's been part of the good work in Let New York Vote, which the Brennan Center and the League is very active in, so that's hopeful. This is not a complete solution to fixing the woes of New York, but we do think it's laying good groundwork and shows that there's some appetite for progress here, and so we hope that this happens and that you all support that. So I think it's clear there are challenges and that are faced not just here in New York, but nationwide. I'd like to put this slide up to think about what we at the Brennan Center do and how we're taking the fight forward in sort of a four-pronged approach. It's fighting in the court of public opinion through media, press, popular writing, interviews, things like that. Doing research and analysis, issuing reports that are cited by courts, by academics, and others. We do legislative advocacy, trying to get jurisdictions to pass good laws to expand access to the polls and access to the voter rolls. And we litigate. We go to court and fight, whether it's the trial court, we file briefs in the Supreme Court, we're all over the country. So we take a full menu approach to how we fight back. As I said, I think I've said a couple times, but we really do. We represent the League, whether it's a national chapter or state chapters, in several cases, and it's a big part of our work. So I'll go through each of those to give you a sense of what we're doing and where things stand. On data and research, we have this pro-voter agenda report. It's issued by one of my colleagues who heads up our voting team and offers, frankly, practical ways that we can reform the voting process and registration process to be more pro-voter. Things like automatic voter registration, portability where if you move, your registration follows you. Doing things to guard against insider abuse by poll workers and election administrators. Frankly, increasing the security of our voting machines, just a taste of some of the proposals there. The non-citizen voting report I mentioned a bit earlier was, we think, really important to debunk some of these ridiculous claims of widespread million votes or fraudulent votes. I gave you some stats, but another tidbit from this report. In California, Virginia, and New Hampshire, states where the president claimed specifically there to have been a problematic trend of non-citizen voting, not a single official we spoke with identified an incident of non-citizen voting in the 2016 election. Not one. We do work in the press. Mirna Perez, who's in this top clip, is the head of our voting rights team, and she's on Fox News. I mean, we're out there dealing with and confronting questions from not the friendliest audiences because, frankly, that's the way you change minds. One of my colleagues, Jonathan Grader, another lawyer, just quoted, I think a week or two ago, about a range of issues, but frankly, the threat to voter privacy by delving into some to records here without proper authorization. So on the legislative front, I want to highlight two issues that we're really focusing on and pushing. One I mentioned earlier, and I think Pat mentioned even in the start of her remarks, given what's happening in your county government, automatic voter registration, the other being rights restoration. So automatic voter registration really entails two key changes to the way we register folks: opt-out and electronic transfer. I'll take each in turn. Opt-out is a pretty minor change. What it says is, when you interact with a government agency, and the DMV is the most common, you will be registered or have your registration updated unless you opt out. There's a clear box where you can decline, but that subtle shift is actually pretty significant in terms of impact on helping folks who are eligible get on the rolls. It's also cheaper. I mean, AVR, automatic voter registration, cheaper because it entails this other piece, which is electronic transfer. And that's the idea that when you're interacting with that agency like the DMV, the information is then transferred directly to election officials without having typos or illegible handwriting and entered right into the voter registration system. I should also say the AVR, or automatic voter registration proposal, includes other things to make sure that folks who are not eligible do not end up on the rolls, and protections for those who might end up by mistake without their own fault. Confidentiality protections for people like domestic abuse victims, and public education campaigns to make sure people know what's happening, how their information is being used, what changes, if any, are happening to forms of the DMV, things like that. We think there are substantial benefits to this, and the evidence has shown that in the early states that have adopted automatic voter registration. We think it, frankly, increases numbers. Oregon is the great example of this. They were one of the first, if not the first, I should say, to implement, and they quadrupled their rate of new registration, new registrants at the DMV after implementing automatic voter registration. We think it reduces errors. We have Maricopa County in Arizona there as an example. But the electronic transfer piece is pretty critical to reducing the kinds of errors where one letter is misspelled and next thing you know, you have a problem when you go to vote because your name doesn't match up with what's on the poll book. Cost savings, I think it lowers the cost of administering a registration process, largely because it streamlines things, it removes more errors. Washington, which implemented adopted the first half of the electronic element of automatic voter registration, has saved $125,000 in the first year of implementation. So that's pretty substantial. Not surprising then, we're seeing more states embrace this. So 2015 saw Oregon and California leading the way. We added 4 others in 2016, and it's, I think, important to note that West Virginia and Vermont saw really broad bipartisan support when they did this. This past year saw 4 more states join, DC, Colorado, Rhode Island, Illinois. Colorado I'd highlight because they did it administratively without the new statute. Illinois had really significant bipartisan support in the legislature for theirs as well, and we call out Rhode Island and Illinois because they did it not only at the DMV but also included other social service agencies, which we think is the right move if those agencies have good data and are able to deal with implementation. It's also a trend we're seeing in the legislature. So we've highlighted the 15 states thus far this year that have introduced AVR bills for consideration. That's actually a little bit lower than what it really is because 32 states, and there's some overlap, have carryover bills where a law or bill was put up in the legislature in 2017 and then carried over. So New York is an example of that. Switching over to rights restoration, and this ties back to the disenfranchisement point earlier. This is the idea that it shouldn't be so cumbersome when someone finishes their sentence to get their voting rights back. On this front, we've seen 11 states with bills this year that would expand the voting rights of people with past criminal convictions. On this front, it's interesting. This is an issue where there's been bipartisan support as well. Example, then Governor George W. Bush of Texas signed a rights restoration law when he was governor of Texas. Governors McAuliffe, a Democrat, and McDonnell, Republican of Virginia, opposing parties, both took substantial effort to restore the rights of their citizens of Virginia to vote. In New York, there's a coalition pushing to restore the right to vote, affecting nearly 45,000 New Yorkers, currently denied those rights solely because they've not yet finished their terms of parole. As I mentioned earlier, New York is in this odd situation where they draw a distinction between probation and parole, so we'd like to see that cleaned up and changed. So I want to highlight what's going on in Florida, which is responsible for 1.5 million people who can't vote as a result of their criminal record. These are people who are out of prison, to be clear. So not 1.5 million people out of prison who have completed their sentences. That's roughly a fifth of African Americans in the state of Florida. So there's some hope here. There's a ballot initiative and an active effort to change the state's constitution and restore voting rights to most people who have completed their sentences. Floridians for a Fair Democracy is a group that successfully gathered enough signatures to put this on the ballot and send it to the voters for consideration. We, the Brennan Center, helped draft the amendment a few years back based on extensive polling and other research. So if the initiative passes and it requires 60% of voters to approve it, we think it would automatically restore the voting rights to most of that 1.5 million number of citizens who are disenfranchised in Florida.
Plus, it's at the bar really low on what a felony is.
That's right. So I also want to highlight our litigation work, and I'm calling out sort of two specific cases and areas that are pretty timely and pretty serious to what's going on: voter ID and extreme gerrymandering. So our work, and what we think is one of the most important cases we deal with, is a case called VZ versus Abbott in federal court in Texas. We're challenging Texas's voter ID law, which is probably the most restrictive in the country. You may remember this is the law where you could use your concealed carry permit but not your student ID to vote. So, shockingly, the law had substantial and significant discriminatory effect. The trial court found that Latino registered voters were over 3 times more likely to lack ID than Anglo voters. That's pretty wild. We also believe, as did the trial court, that the law intentionally discriminated against minority citizens in Texas. In fact, in the years since we brought this lawsuit in 2013, it's not been 5 years, federal district court has twice found the law intentionally discriminatory, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals recognized its discriminatory impact. So there was oral argument in the Fifth Circuit, which is the appellate court covering Texas, in December about the state's appeal, and we await a decision there. Gilby Whitford extreme gerrymandering case. As many of you probably know, gerrymandering involves a drawing of legislative districts and lines to benefit certain politicians and parties, typically by manipulating the borders and districts to the benefit of those drawing them, frankly. Last November, a 3-judge panel in this case declared that the state house plan adopted by Wisconsin's Republican-controlled legislature was an unconstitutional gerrymander, violating the Equal Protection Clause and First Amendment rights of the plaintiffs. It was the first time in over 3 decades that a federal court had invalidated a redistricting plan for partisan bias, and that's pretty important. The Supreme Court heard this case in October, heard the argument, and it previously issued a stay on the order to redraw the map. So what that means is the lower court's order that there need to be a new map new map drawn was put on hold until the Supreme Court could decide what to do with it. Our thoughts are that we're cautiously optimistic about prospects here based on the argument, our read of the court and the justices, but we will see. This will have, depending on how this comes out, could have a very substantial impact on districts across the country. So our last topic, right, so I go through history, some current issues, Securing elections. It's timely. It's in the press constantly. We just indicted some Russians for doing things that try to affect our elections. It's very much front and center in a lot of folks' minds. It's a little scary. Cyber attacks against election systems around the world have actually become far too common. We're not alone in the US on that score. So, we list the problem here as growing cyber threats. I think it's probably useful to think about it as the cybersecurity threats are not specific to our voting systems. They're to our government and our systems generally. But there's an emphasis on potentially attacking, undermining our confidence in our systems and infiltrating them as well. We don't have to look too far beyond the still controversial topic of Russians meddling in 2016 to realize that this is a real threat. And although I should say this, the Russians have shown interest and ability to compromise or attack our systems. The evidence to date that we're aware of shows they did not actually hack our machines, the systems that tabulate our votes. There's evidence they did, however, access voter registration systems, and that's scary on its own. I guess another point to make is the Russians aren't the only adversary to worry about here. The US government has blamed North Korea's spy agency for the ransomware attack that locked up the computers of government agencies and businesses in 150 countries in May. While Al-Qaeda and ISIS have both shown willingness to hack foreign government websites. So it'd be naive and extreme to think that, number one, the threat only comes from Russia, or two, that enemies of our country might not have an interest in wreaking havoc on our voting systems and sowing doubt about the validity of our elections. This is happening all against the backdrop of, I mentioned the Help America Vote Act earlier, right? 2002, or 3, excuse me. So it's been 15 years since that law was passed, and that law, among other things, provided money to the states to upgrade their voting machines or upgrade their voting infrastructure. Many of those systems since then have aged without Congress doing anything to bolster them. So what that means is most of our voting systems and machines are very antiquated, not getting updates, and more vulnerable to attack. So this is a bad map. States with machines that are more than 10 years old. And it's most of them, 40, frankly. And that, I've been highlighting here tonight where things are cutting across partisan lines, geographic lines, and that's nearly every part of the country.
The red states.
Yes, the red states are machines that are 10 years old. Or 10 plus years old. So having a paper trail is actually really important in the event of a hack, right, to understand what happened. And as you can see here, every jurisdiction in 5 states, and those are the dark red ones, uses paperless machines as its primary equipment on election day. The lighter states, there are roughly 400 selected jurisdictions in those states with the same problem, where they're using paperless machines as their primary election day equipment. So without a paper trail, it's tough. Here's another troubling map. Here, you're seeing the highlighted states. These are states that don't have a voter-verified paper record, a little bit different, but also problematic, because that would be what you would use to independently confirm the software that's being run is not hacked. Right, so that's pretty substantial. So these are problems that are frightening, but also ones that we know most, if not, well, we know solutions to these problems. And I highlight here the Secure Elections Act was introduced in 2017, but it captures the key steps that we ought to be taking to shore up our election systems and infrastructure. And this ought to be a clear bipartisan solution to something that's a threat to our democracy. So it contains the relevant ingredients. Those include a $386 million grant program that states could access to implement cybersecurity guidelines and recommendations. It would help states replace old voting machines with new ones that process paper ballots, which, as I mentioned, is key to understanding whether there have been hacks or systems that were compromised. It would also authorize grants for agencies to do risk and vulnerability assessments, which are key to understanding what problems you actually have in your systems. And it would do things to foster more timely and thorough communications between and across and among the various players, right? Our systems of elections have state officials, county officials, federal folks who do this. So there's a lot of intra and inter-agency communication that needs to happen. Frankly, all of these things are sound recommendations that seem straightforward but could divert what could be a national disaster into something that we're really interested in seeing happen. So I'm going to stop there, but I've left a lot of time for questions, which I hope folks will have. Okay, and Pat, Andy, you want to? Yeah, come on. Sure, please.
Okay.
I'll grab you the mic. Oh, okay.
Thank you. I noticed you didn't mention the fat guy on the bed who was hacking the system. I want to reiterate as in response to what he pointed out as some solutions that today, again, in Saratoga County, the Board of Supervisors voted down automatic voter registration and early voting. You may want to...
Can you provide us how to reach out to those people and write their...
We can. So, yes, and Tara, one of our supervisors who voted against the measure, can speak to that. I'll just 1 second, okay? Chris, I think it would be helpful if you talked about felons, and Steve, you pointed that out. These are not necessarily axe murderers. These are drug use and so forth, right? So if you could expand on that.
Sure.
And the danger of voter ID laws. It sounds easy enough. Just go down to the town hall and get a voter ID. Why is that a version of poll tax? That would be helpful too. And in response to the league being communist, that's kind of better than what we saw on the internet the other day. Some local guy was bashing us, and he finally conceded, well, they're not as bad as the KKK. So I don't know where this reputation's coming from, but if you could address some of those, and then Tara will bring you in to talk about that. Thank you.
Sure. So the first, felony disenfranchisement laws, and of course the caveat being these laws vary across all 50 states and the District of Columbia. But to Pat's point, there are plenty of crimes that are not violent crimes, things like narcotics, drug offenses, that are felonies that can result in a disqualification or disenfranchisement of voting rights. So, it's key to keep in mind that we're not just talking about violent, long-term incarcerated individuals. There's a whole other range of crimes that are felonies that often disenfranchise folks from voting. The second point was voter ID, right? And so the idea of, we at the Brennan Center support the idea that we ought to have secure elections. We're not opposed, and frankly, we encourage election officials to keep their rules accurate. We want secure and safe and accurate elections. What ends up happening is a lot of these laws on voter ID are drawn or written in a way that makes it expensive, inconvenient, or hard for people to get identification. The list of the Texas law is a good example, right? You can't vote with a student ID, but you can vote with a concealed carry permit. Or they reduce the hours the DMV is open, or close them so you have to drive during the workday an insane distance. These laws would make it harder for anyone, but in particular make it harder for people of lesser means, and would make it harder for people who live in communities who tend to be minority and are the places where these kinds of offices tend to close. So it's not just the idea of having identification that's necessarily bad, it's the way in which the laws in particular are crafted. I had another question from Lorraine. Okay.
Tara, do you want to speak about what the vote today? Sure. There's a mic right there. Oh gosh, I'm loud as that. Yeah, not that short.
Sorry. So I did want to clarify, the board didn't vote against early voting and automatic voter registration. What they did is, in this year's legislative agenda, they put forth as one of their items to discourage the state government for moving forward on early voting and automatic voter registration. So they didn't technically vote against it for the county, but they are speaking out very strongly against it. I am very proud to say that myself and my fellow supervisor from Saratoga Springs voted against it. It still carried. But we did vote against it because both of us believe very strongly in improving voter participation wherever necessary. If you want to figure out how to contact anyone, you can feel free to come snag me. You can also go to the county website, SaratogaCountyNY.gov, and all of our names, our phone numbers, and our email addresses are there. And trust me, you can find them because I also heard about the 50 comments that were sent to the board today about the vote today. Good job.
So if others have questions, you mind coming over to the mic or?
So I guess my question is about those states that don't have a paper backup. Because of what's going on with the whole Russia thing and we're worried about our elections being hacked, are they going to have some pressure put on them to maybe have paper ballots too as backup?
So I think the short answer is it depends. And it's tough. It's not the great answer. I do think there is bipartisan support, or there's some bipartisan support in Congress to do something like the Secure Elections Act. There are Democrats and Republicans who are suggesting they're supportive or open to it. Frankly, I think that would likely be the best way for the change to happen because there's money with it, as opposed to the states being on the hook themselves to change it. So I think we've focused our attention there just because it seems like the most likely way that you will affect this nationwide.
Thanks.
Sure.
If you'd like to ask a question, would you come down here?
Sorry.
I just had a question reference to gerrymandering. First of all, if I know that Pennsylvania, they basically told them they had to. Wisconsin, they didn't say they had to yet. But if they do tell them they have to change the gerrymandering lines, my first question is, how do they decide that will be random? And also, when will it go into effect? Will it go into effect before 2018 election? Or do we have to wait for more?
That's a great question.
For more rigged elections here.
So the Pennsylvania example is a great one. And by the way, the Pennsylvania League is plaintiff in that case. So that case went to the state Supreme Court, and they invalidated the congressional maps under the state constitution, which was important because the ways in which it can end up in the U.S. Supreme Court are quite narrow. So in Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court gave the legislature and the governor some amount of time to come up with a new map. And if they didn't do that, then the court, through their own process with assistance of experts, drew their own map. And that's exactly what happened. The Republican-controlled legislature in Pennsylvania sent a proposal to the governor, Governor Wolf, who's a Democrat. He rejected it, and the court issued a new map just a little over a week ago. And they're using that map as of, I think, today or a few days prior to...
More fair map?
Yes,
Okay.
and they're using that map right now to petition to get on the ballot for the May primary, November
Great.
general. And that's Pennsylvania, and that's under state law. So the answer to what might happen based on the Supreme Court case, Gail v. Whitford, it depends. And it depends presumably on the timing of the decision and whether there's an order to redraw. So states have done this quickly, but it's hard to know.
Can I just ask Chris quickly, the census being done in 2020, there are some antics being done about how that census will be completed, which has implications. Are you doing anything related to that?
Yeah, one of the key concerns is that they're trying to insert a question about citizenship into the census questionnaire or interviews process, which the thinking seems to be that by doing that, you will suppress the response rate of folks who are undocumented, and that could affect the tabulation of people resident in states and districts. So it could throw congressional allocation of seats into a different number than one would expect and have quite a bit of impact. So yes, it's on our radar.
Hi. And along those lines, I did the census the last time in Poughkeepsie, New York, which has like 30% minority community, and a question like that in that Latin community would, I mean, they shut the door on it right away. It'd be almost impossible. My question, I have two of them. The first one is, to what extent, if any, does partisan politics play in the actual voting boards, both countywide and statewide, on this problem? And then the second one, you mentioned the disbanding of the infamous Elections Integrity Commission, but my understanding is that they want to move it into the Department of Homeland Security, and what's going on with that?
So the Brennan Center is nonpartisan. So we're sometimes hesitant to say things that get too much away from that. The question, though, about election officials, it varies by state, and in most states, the person who oversees election issues is the Secretary of State who runs for election. That's a partisan race. So we see Republicans and Democrats, depending on the state, occupy that office. Other county folks, whether it's a county clerk that's sometimes elected, sometimes appointed, or sometimes there's a board, it's a combination of the two. So there is partisan impact on the selection process of those who serve at the state or city or county level. I hesitate to say much more beyond that because we've seen things like automatic voter registration, which I highlighted, where we do get bipartisan support in some instances. In others, that's not the case. But there are some instances where things that you would think would cut partisan doesn't, and it shouldn't, because frankly, the idea that people who are eligible ought to be able to vote and be registered is something that ought not to be a partisan issue. So that's helpful for us when we see that. Your other question, I'm sorry, was about the Fraud Commission. Right. So when the commission was disbanded, there was a statement, I think it might have been with the press release announcing that it was disbanding, that the Homeland Security Department would take up some of the work. Since then, through a statement, I think in court, in federal court, as well as public statements the agency has made, in effect, our understanding is that the requests that were made by the commission to the states they're mooted, they're withdrawn, they're no longer active. And so to the extent information was not given, it's not going to be given. And our understanding, at least based on the public statements, is that the information will not be transferred, that information being things that the commission collected, to Homeland Security. But we're watching.
So thank you, Chris, for a very informative presentation, and to the League for hosting this event. I wondered if you could address a fear that I have in terms of suppressing election hacking. And my fear, other than that, it looks like Congress and our president is doing nothing right now to move forward in stopping this from happening again. But ultimately, if I'm correct, all elections are the responsibility of local and state government. And what's the motivation for states that need or want Russian hacking to sway their elections? It almost feels like there's not motivation in counties and districts that want the election to go in a certain direction.
So, I can't speak to what's animating people who are not interested in protecting their systems, but it seems to me, regardless of political strife, that the last thing you'd want as an elected official is your constituents doubting the veracity of the results. That seems to me to be something that cuts across party lines, because you want people to be confident that you won the race or you won the election, the results were fair. So I think that matters, and I think it does drive, or ought to drive, an interest in officials of whatever party to be doing things to make sure that the results are accurate and that people think they're accurate. Right? Those are two different things that matter. if there's a perception of compromised systems and results, that's also dangerous.
Hi. I wanted to ask, focus on a little bit on New York State, and with this proposed automatic voter registration from the governor's proposal, I'm wondering if that would tend to discriminate against a lot of people who live, say, in New York City who don't vote. And I have a different question after.
Okay. So, early voting or automatic voter registration?
Automatic voter
Okay.
registration.
So what the governor put in the budget proposal is to fund early voting. As far as I know, I don't think there's a proposal in what the governor's pushing right now to make automatic voter registration happen this year. So, but maybe if I'm missing something, you should tell me.
I know we put the $7 million into
Yeah.
the early voting.
Right. But help me understand the question on the city. What?
Well, I'm thinking that there are way fewer drivers in New York City than there are in the upstate counties.
So I don't know those numbers, at my fingertips, but part of what we at the Brennan Center try to push when we do automatic voter registration advocacy is the DMV is the obvious first place to start, right? Most people, a lot of people, have a reason to interact with the DMV. And not just drivers. Identification cards usually come from the DMV. But when we think about the best approach to automatic voter registration, include other social service agencies and other agencies that people regularly interact with. So to that point, we try to do the work to think about what agencies are interacting with a lot of citizens, have good data about residency, citizenship, so that we're making sure it's only eligible people who come on. So I think in an ideal world, what would happen in New York would be the DMV plus, and that plus being an assessment of other agencies that are capable or become capable are then able to implement automatic voter registration.
And then I know that New York State has rather partisan gerrymandering within the state for the Assembly and for the Senate, since they've been drawn on partisan lines. How do we counteract that?
So I think it's like anywhere else. There's a mix of fighting in the courts, and there's a mix of fighting in the legislature. So Pennsylvania example I mentioned earlier, those were state law claims under the state constitution. Right? There's certainly an avenue for federal claims in federal court, and that avenue may no longer exist based on how the Supreme Court comes out in the Wisconsin case, to be determined. But it doesn't change the fact that if there are laws and ways you can do it under state law, that's an option. But frankly, the best way is to convince and elect legislators who have the courage to face their voters without cheating via gerrymandering. And that's easier said than done, but I think that's the real answer.
My question is about voter roll scrubbing. I know that in the last election that 163,000 people were scrubbed off the voter rolls in Manhattan, and people go to vote and they think they're ready to vote, and they get there and they're no longer qualified. And as far as good old Chris Kobach and his interstate cross-check program, I read this, and I don't know if it's true, that he went through based on racial criteria to eliminate duplicate voting. He supposedly had 7 million people scrubbed from the voter rolls. And what's to keep that from happening again? Supposedly that's why Trump won the electoral college.
Yeah, so you're right to identify this as a problem.
I mean, it's a big problem,
yeah.
and it can happen again.
Yep. So we refer to this as list maintenance, right? This is the idea that election officials are supposed to and required to do things to keep the rolls accurate and up to date. When folks move out of their districts or when folks move in, people die, people get convicted and lose their voting rights. These are all things that election officials who maintain the registration records and rolls have to contend with. It's tough. The cross-check program is something that Chris Kobach from our now defunct Fraud Commission he spearheads a system where states can participate in this program, cross-check, and they get checks against a list of their states and other data sources supposedly about citizenship or where people have moved or dying, and those results presumably show that there are people who are on 2 states. The problem is, and there are many, a problem is that the matching criteria in the cross-check system is very low, and that means if you have some name that's not exactly the same or a birth date that's not exactly the same, you might be a match. And the way the system works is they send these potential matches to the relevant officials in whatever the state or county may be for them to determine whether there's anything to do. And that can lead to people purging, which is our language, we say it's a purge, if you're kicking someone off the rolls who ought not to be. And when you're doing things like matching imperfectly, there's a high likelihood that that's exactly what you're doing. So this is something we pay a lot of attention to. Just today, I think, my colleagues in the voting team put out what we call our mini purge report, which is a prelude of a broader report to come, but about threats to the rolls and purge efforts that are happening in 2018 and that we see as current threats. So it's something that we do a lot of thinking about, because the other side of this is we do want to have accurate rolls, right? There are things that people who maintain the registration records ought to do to make sure the rolls are accurate, but that line of doing the right kind of diligence can quickly and easily become into purges and kicking people off the rolls.
Yeah, the thing is that he targeted people that have common names, like Hispanic names, Asian names, and sometimes African American names, where, like, say, Tyrone Washington, they found every man named Tyrone Washington, and they must be the same person, when all the Tyrone Washingtons were just automatically eliminated. And so it got so that everybody with T Washington, or somebody with a, it just got so that the level of match just got so low that, I mean, he couldn't scrub enough, so he just kept scrubbing and lowering the criteria down and down and down. And it's very unfair to minorities and people with common names, and it's what a way to eliminate people. I wouldn't want to go and say, okay, I always vote, show up, and that I can't vote because I've been scrubbed because my name is common.
So it's hardly a solution, but one of the things that we support at the Brennan Center is same-day registration, right? Which is the idea that you show up, something happened, right? Whether because there's a bad actor or someone just made a mistake and trying in good faith to keep their rolls up to date. And you aren't on the rolls, but you ought to be. So we think you ought to be able to register right there at the voting site and vote. It seems to me to be an obvious answer to these kinds of problems with maintaining the rules while also giving a fail-safe. Some mistake happened, okay, fine, re-register, you can vote. So it's a reason why we support something like that just as a last-ditch protection measure. Oh, please. Sorry, hand in the back too, okay.
I thought that there was a principle in our country about equal voting rights. So I don't understand how gerrymandering can happen and some of the other ways that the weight of each person's vote is not equal. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so the way it happens is less about, we're talking congressional districts, for instance. The numbers have to be roughly even. Set aside that Wyoming gets a member of Congress despite being tiny. Generally speaking, the districts have to be pretty close in population size. What happens is folks who are gerrymandering draw the lines in a way that they pump all of the voters in one district or one party into really compact districts and then spread them out into the others so they're just enough where they win those few seats in the districts where all of their party members, and then they lose the rest because they're spread out in the other districts, right? So what ends up happening is you see that the results of a statewide election, right? Let's assume a party wins something like 55% of the vote. It ends up with 2/3 or more of the seats. That's a good indication that it's been gerrymandered. So in that sense, yes, the people are roughly equal in population in the districts, but their votes are being diluted in the sense that they're not seeing the results match the representation.
And for the federal elections? for the president, it would seem that some people's vote would not weigh as much as other people's because of the weight in the specific states.
Yeah, the most valuable, well, it's pretty valuable, excuse me, to be a voter in Wyoming because you get free electoral college rates. So it's an unfortunate flaw of our electoral college system.
Get rid of it. Please do.
I appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you.
So I had 2 questions, now I probably have 3 or 4. So that's good enough. So when we talked about automatic voter registration.
Please use the microphone.
So you had mentioned automatic voter registration, and I believe you said that there were built-in safeguards there, so people that are ineligible would not be able to register.
Right.
So my question was, what kind of safeguards are built in? And then on top of that, we've just heard about this cross-check system and also the poor data matching. So how does that all work with automatic voter registration?
So I guess in terms of safeguards, when you, for instance, interact with the DMV, right, one of the things that has to happen in the DMV in order for there to be automatic voter registration is verification of citizenship, that you're a resident of the state, and that your address is consistent with that. So the information that's going to whoever the officials are on the other side for registering you relies on the verification of those key things that show that you're eligible to vote. So that's the key piece of it. The other question, it seems to me, is getting at what happens with cross-check or other efforts to do list maintenance and how automatic voter registration interacts with that.
Well, I would think if there were safeguards to the automatic voter registration process, that those people were already vetted when they registered.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're talking about cross-checking and these bad data matching processes, and even the small amount of legal citizens that have tried to vote and were then found to be non-eligible. So I guess I'm wondering if these small instances happen, and we already need to provide birth certificates, social security cards, and all of that when we go to someplace like the DMV to register, then I don't understand how automatic voter registration will really work if we're talking about these other instances kind of working against that. I mean, it almost makes it doesn't make it worthwhile.
If you think about it this way, maybe this is helpful. So someone goes and registers correctly, and they're registered automatically. They're on the rolls. Then they die. Right? At some point, they ought not to be on the rolls anymore. And so the list maintenance efforts presumably should reasonably find a way to check the death file and make sure that the match is perfect, or as perfect as it can be, and take that person off the rolls.
Okay.
So automatic voter registration deals with the front end of that, right? Getting people who ought to be on the rolls. And it's a separate, distinct thing from there ought to be reasonable list maintenance efforts. There ought not to be efforts that are effectively purges of people who should still be registered taken off.
It is simple and it is upfront, but this is something that our legislatures will work against because of these other issues that we face per list maintenance, which is why I was asking.
Sure.
So my next question for you. In the examples that you were given, you said that Oregon quadrupled the registrations for automatic voting registration. So I guess my follow-up question to that is, if they were able to have that much of an increase in voter registration, was there any correlation to voter participation after that?
So I think the answer is yes. I want to just check. I'm going to give you a stat, but I want to make sure I give it to you correctly, so give me just a minute. Okay, so the number that we've seen come out of Oregon, which I think speaks to this, is that Oregon saw 225,000 eligible citizens automatically registered in the lead up to the 2016 election. As we understand it, 100,000 of those voted. So that's pretty, I don't have the turnout rates on my fingertips, but. Sure, thank you.
But a blue state,
Yes, but
not like the land of Joseph Carter.
fair, although if we think about that map of places that have done automatic voter registration, it includes places like West Virginia, includes Georgia. So this is, and we saw it pass in places with substantial bipartisan support. Illinois is an example of that, where a Republican governor signed it. So we've seen it where there's support on both sides of the aisle.
One more quick question. Can you speak at all, it's a hot button issue, about the idea of open primaries and the idea behind it that you're disenfranchising all of the non-affiliated voters, which is a huge number of voters across the country from the very beginning of the process of voting?
So you may not like this answer because I don't think the Brennan Center has a position, so I will respectfully decline. Or one that I'm aware of.
Okay, we'll take one or two more questions.
Yep. Go ahead and we'll go up there next. Or go ahead, please.
So, one of the rationales that I've heard for why some people do not register or they don't vote, because they think of their one singular vote as being insignificant. I was wondering if you have a position on the concept of incentivizing registration or voting, as some countries do.
Oh, interesting. I'm going to give you, the question was about whether we at the Brennan Center have a view about incentivizing voting, and you suggesting that some other countries have done things to incentivize people to vote. I'm going to give you the same answer, unfortunately, but I'm happy to talk afterward of my own views. I don't think we do, but I'm happy to talk afterward about it.
In New Zealand, you are required to vote, and when I lived there, I kept getting phone call after phone call asking me why I didn't vote, when I kept telling them, I am not a citizen. I mean, they're after me. So, maybe they should require it.
I'd just like to make a quick point about what you said about the Pennsylvania case. Just a clarification, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
The Supreme Court didn't rule that Pennsylvania had illegally gerrymandered their congressional districts. What they ruled, and it was a one justice opinion, was it Alito? Was that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had the right to decide that the state was illegally gerrymandered.
So, a refinement, if I could. The state Supreme Court, Pennsylvania Supreme Court, struck down the map, violating the state constitution. The legislators, the Republican legislators appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and because the way the Supreme Court divides these things, Justice Alito had responsibility for something coming out of that circuit, and denied the request for a stay. There wasn't a ruling on the merits, as I would understand it, about the claim itself. He just denied the request.
And just basic election 101. I've lived in states where they had early voting, but is there a federal law that governs how early voting can take place?
Not that I'm aware of. Let's take one more. Please, sir.
Can you speak loudly?
Oh, I'm good at that. Now, I don't even know this gentleman at all. But my comment is, when you walk in any conversation today, why should I vote? My vote doesn't matter. My background is so often related to behavioral response. In New York State, we hear over and over about core curriculums here and core curriculums there. Maybe it's time we take a little tweak in our colleges of education and say maybe a little bit more to the value of your vote to a high schooler in a presentation in a social studies class or whatever. What do you think of that?
I'll say simply this. We are a democracy, and it doesn't work, right, if the people aren't giving their consent. And to me, if you aren't having people engaged, and that means on the rolls and voting, and and not turning out, it calls into question the legitimacy of our system of government. So I think whatever the solutions are, that's a problem. And I personally think that we ought to do things to make sure that the governed are actually making their voices heard, one way or the other. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you to Chris for leaving his 14-month-old baby to come up and be with us. And just a couple of quick announcements. One is that our third and final session in this series is on March 27th. It's a really important culmination of these first. I think Chris. I'm thinking you are. It is the First Amendment. Our obligation to assemble, protest, and protect the free press. It is really important to us. Joining us, same place, March 27th. We are going to open the program with 1 or 2 students speaking for a few minutes who are the ones leading the school walkouts this month, local students. Us talking about why that's important. The League has a strong position in support of gun safety, and so we've invited them to say a couple of words. If you are not a member of the League of Women Voters, that's okay, but consider becoming one. It's very inexpensive, and it is one of the few organizations that is a one-stop shop, whether you're interested in gun issues or the environment or women's reproductive issues, we're on it. So I would encourage you, Nancy, where are you? There's a membership. The membership table out there. At least grab a brochure and think about it. Thanks again to Chris, and thank you to you for coming.